Over a month ago, the folks at XtraCycle loaned me a new RFA. That's a multi-purpose compact electric cargo bike, and I've loved riding it. You know who else loves riding it? My son. He sits on the back as we cruise around the neighborhood and actually looks forward to running errands with me. But what if you have a bigger family? I spoke with Kate, an XtraCycle owner from Raleigh, North Carolina, and mother of 4, and here's what she had to say.
I have 4 kids. Right now, they are 6, 4, 2, and an infant. I've always wanted to live in a bigger city where I could walk everywhere and not get in a car. So I saw these e-bikes and I was like, hey, maybe this could bridge the gap and give me the best of both worlds. I spoke with XtraCycle. They were incredibly helpful, talked to me on the phone for over an hour to nail down the right bike for me.
Kate opted for the XtraCycle Swoop, which is perfect for hauling multiple kids. She and her husband loved it so much that they also wound up getting an RFA. And even though they still need to drive every now and then, the bikes have taken a primary place in their lives.
We actually have 2 cars. However, I will say that the second car got booted to the driveway so that the bikes could live in the garage.
With 4 little kids, Kate is used to juggling a whole lot of gear, something that usually causes parents to default to taking the car. But she's found that loading up the XtraCycle is a piece of cake.
It's got that huge cargo bag on the front. I mean, I can actually fit a travel stroller in that compartment on the front. So like if I'm going to Target or wherever and I feel like I'm going to need a stroller when we get there, I can just stick that in there.
There's another advantage of getting around by e-cargo bike, and it's one you won't find in the tech specs or the user's manual.
My kids love the bike. Like from the day we got it, they love riding on the bike. They beg to take the bike places. Getting them in the car, on the other hand, is such a chore. And, you know, you're fighting with them and then you're fighting them to get in the car seat and they're clawing your face off and you're like, ah. My 2-year-old actually sometimes runs into the garage, gets on the bike and just sits out there screaming, go bike. There's just something about, you know, riding around with your kids and the breeze and the fresh air and the sunshine and their favorite song, and everyone is smiling.
If you have a growing family and are wondering how an e-cargo bike could improve your life, listen to Kate.
If someone came up to me and was unsure if they were ready to take the plunge and they had a bigger family, I think I would just tell them to go for it and that it will change their life for the best. I think the impact on your mental health, the way that we're more spontaneous now, you know, we're riding home from school and it's like, hey, let's go to a park. Hey, let's go to that brewery. And spending time together, doing an activity we all really love. Yeah, I think talk to the people at XtraCycle because they sold me and I have absolutely no regrets. Best decision.
We here at the War on Cars agree. Getting an e-cargo bike is the best decision, and we want everyone to enjoy the benefits of cargo biking, whether to reduce or even relieve the need for cars in your life. Head to extracycle.com/thewaroncars and take the 1-minute ride guide. That's a quiz that will help you find out which XtraCycle bike is best for you. And if you decide to purchase a bike, you'll save $500 by using the promo code WARONCARS500. Again, that's extracycle.com/thewaroncars. This is the War on Cars. I am Doug Gordon. So in our episode today, we are going to be asking the question, what makes a city a cycling city? Is it good bike infrastructure? Yes. Is it well-behaved cyclists? Maybe. Is it good leadership? Also yes. Why have some cities become the kind of places where it's easy to hop on a bike for daily transportation needs, while others have languished and just been left behind? Is there some sort of magical combination of policy, engineering, advocacy, and interest from regular citizens that adds up to separate the best cycling cities from basically everywhere else? Our guests for this episode have a lot of theories backed up by history, research, and personal experience examining cities around the world, and their answers are really fascinating and might even surprise you. But first, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/thewaroncarspod. You can pick up official podcast merch, including stickers and t-shirts, at thewaroncars.org. And you can pre-order our new book, Life After Cars, Freeing Ourselves from the Tyranny of the Automobile, which is coming this October from Thesis, an imprint of Penguin Random House. Visit lifeaftercars.com to get your copy and find out about events and our book tour. Okay, so our guests for this episode. Ruth Oldenziel is a professor at Eindhoven University of Technology, and she leads the research and public outreach for the Cycling Cities Project, which we're going to talk about. And she's a founding member of the Dutch Cycling Academy, as well as a prolific writer on subjects related to urban mobility and cycling in particular. Dorcas Nyamai is an urban development researcher at International Planning Studies at TU Dortmund University in Germany. Her research centers on spatial justice in the city and urban mobility. Her doctoral research addressed the prospects for advancing walking and cycling in Nairobi. And she is authoring a chapter about the Kenyan capital in the upcoming African Experience. She's also the coordinator for Walking Cities, which is an offshoot of the Cycling Cities program, which I'd love to talk about as well. Ruth and Dorcas, welcome to the War on Cars.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Well, I'm really excited to talk about this with you because I think it's a subject, that I'm fascinated by, and I know our listeners are. What does it take to make a place what we believe is the best place for cycling? And usually when we have these conversations, we're very narrowly focused on just a few marquee cities like Copenhagen or Amsterdam or Utrecht. Paris is getting a lot of attention right now, and rightfully so. But the Cycling Cities Project really expands the conversation to include tons of global cities. I wonder if we could start just generally, what is the Cycling Cities Project?
Well, it actually started from the premise that Amsterdam or any of the other cities that you were mentioning are model cities. But we realized very early on that we actually don't know why they are cycling cities, what made them so. So this project started in the 1990s, and it was really comparative from the very start. And in the process, we developed 5 factors that examine how a city becomes a cycling city. And one is the urban form, which of course everybody says, well, this is too large a city, you cannot be a cycling city. Or, this is a hilly city, so you cannot be a cycling city. So we looked at urban form as the one. And then the second was mobility alternatives. What are the alternatives people have? Is it expensive? Is it easy, vis-a-vis cycling? So that's factor number 2. Then the third is, of course, infrastructure, policy making. Does that explain it? But then we also, these are sort of things that intuitively we know. But as a historian and a cultural studies person, we also quickly realized that how cycling is looked upon, how it is viewed, is also important. So we call that the representation. As well as, is there cycling advocacy? So there you have it. Those are 5 factors. But the point is, and we have now done 50 plus cities, that it is not one of these factors that determines it. You have to get all 5 factors right in order to turn to green, let's say, and so what do you need? So you need either a compact city and not a sprawl, though if you combine it with public transit, actually you can make longer distances. So distance is not the only thing that's part of it, but the form is very important.
Okay, so Ruth, I can hear a lot of our listeners saying, wait a minute, like a compact city, we need to have a compact city. Well, I live in Los Angeles or I live in Houston, and Dorcas, Nairobi is a very big and sprawling city. So they might be thinking, are we screwed? We can't ever be a cycling city because we're just so big. We are not Amsterdam, as people like to say. So maybe, Dorcas, you could explain a little bit about your experience and the other African cities that you studied and answer the sprawl question.
That was a very interesting deciding factor for what Nairobi became since its independence, because Nairobi blew 8 times bigger than what it was right before independence. And that was from one day to the next that people flocked into the city. So urban sprawl happened like, if you could think about it, it was just the busting of a balloon. And then you had longer distances that people needed to travel. And that's where we saw the bicycle decline sharply. It had been a form of urban mobility especially for the working class at that time, who mainly comprised of the Indians and the Africans. And then what we see happening after independence is that because of the longer distances, motorized mobility becomes the preferred alternative. But that's because also that the bicycles are no longer supported. There's an active lobby from the government in terms of policy and infrastructure to advance more motorized mobility. However, I think this has also witnessed a turn in the past about since 2012, where there has been more representation for cycling, a very strong activist group, a critical mass Nairobi, that has tried to shift that around. And I think for big cities like Nairobi, for example, or Los Angeles for that matter, what works is having precisely mobility alternatives that you can combine walking with public transport. And that's what works in some cities like Berlin, for example, that are very big. You find that people cycle to to a certain station with their bicycle, leave it there, and then take public transport. So it is possible in combination with other mobility alternatives.
And also, I think very few people traverse the width or length of Los Angeles in their daily commute. They're often, traveling around their neighborhood, let's say, or driving 4 miles to work, which is easily cyclable if the conditions allow for cycling. And we tend to see sprawling cities as a series of smaller cities that we could fix and break up.
Yeah, that's correct. And you're very correct to say nobody actually traverses the entire length, even by car, in Los Angeles or the cities that we're looking at, Cairo, Johannesburg, Kano, Nairobi, and so forth. There are neighborhoods within, and a lot of the studies are always talking about commuting from the periphery to the center. But of course, there's a lot of other kind of movements that people do for their work, to visit friends that are based on neighborhoods, and so it is fixable. We're talking about Nairobi or Cairo or Bamako is another example that started like 20,000 people and is now 4 million. And there are all these African cities and cities around the world that have exploded. But it is important to understand that there are communities within, so not all is lost. At the same time, sprawl in general is not really great for cycling. Let's put it this way. It's not a lost case, but if you want to understand how your city works, then you have to look at density. You have to look at that cities are not built around urban highways. And I think that Nairobi is indeed the case of this urban forum. As Dorcas says, it exploded from one day to the next. And we see that in all these other African cities. Governments really struggle with that. And what we see then, and that's sort of that factor number 2, is because a lot of governments fail, also in the United States, right, to provide for public transit. You see in Africa, you see all kinds of entrepreneurial businesses of informal transit, whether that's motorcycle taxis or bicycle taxis or the vans in Nairobi. And that is what people then start to do. It's not so much the war on cars that we need to understand cycling. It is also, well, I don't want to say a war on public transit, but it is understanding our relationship with public transit on the one hand and walking. And I think that Dorcas, that's her expertise really on walking. We tend to forget that all the time when we talk about cycling. But cycling and walking are not the same. They're often categorized as non-motorized. It's a totally misnomer. Historically, pedestrianism is much more important than cycling.
I love a good summer rainstorm, especially on a hot and humid afternoon. And I can enjoy the downpours in style and comfort when I'm wearing my Rover rain cape from Cleverhood. The great thing about the Rover is that it gives you terrific coverage while still allowing for plenty of ventilation, so that you don't get all steamy when you're caught riding in a cloudburst. And now Cleverhood also has the Rover 2.0 with arm snaps for when you want sleeves and a big front pocket that also serves to stow the cape when you're riding dry. You can get 15% off the Rover 2.0 and everything in the Cleverhood store now through the end of August if you use the code SUMMERRAIN at cleverhood.com/waroncars. That's SUMMERRAIN, all one word, at cleverhood.com/waroncars. Wear a Cleverhood and make a splash this summer.
So, Dorcas, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, one of the things in the Cycling Cities research, and Ruth, you talked about this or hinted at this towards the top, is this idea that cycling has a weird cultural status. And one of the factors that goes into making a cycling city exactly that is seeing cycling as just another transportation option and not something that is weighted with the baggage of social meaning that's only for poor people or only for radicals, only for environmentalists, but just a practical means of transportation for everybody. And we see that shifting in a lot of cities, so much so that in some places in North America and Europe, cycling is associated with higher classes, with gentrification, with wealthy people who can live in close-in neighborhoods. Dorcas, I wonder if you could talk about that changing cultural status. If you have a country that suddenly becomes independent and cycling goes from low status to high or high to low, how does that change things?
Yeah, it's a very interesting observation that I have done with the critical mass in Nairobi, because what you see characterizing most of the people in the critical mass is a middle class, is Nairobi's middle class. And what they tend to represent are people, is what cycling, I would say, should not be. It's not a sport that requires wearing certain kind of gear or, dressing in a certain kind of way, having a certain type of bicycle, but it should be an everyday mobility. It's a mobility that should associate with a person who is poor, as it is framed. However, this has become noticeable in many circles within the critical mass, and now they have cycling tours where they dress up in normal clothes and go cycling. However, I think it's also beyond just having cycling as a cultural practice. I think looking at it from a holistic point of view is who has access to these bicycles and what kind of bicycles are there in the market? Is there an industry that supports manufacturing of bicycles? And that is what you lack in many African cities. And because of this lack, it makes the bicycle sort of an elitist mode of mobility, because it depends who can import their bicycle from somewhere and who is willing to pay a certain amount of money to import a certain kind of bicycle that will be then someone will be able to travel through the terrain in Nairobi. So I think what we need to look at when looking at cycling, especially in African cities, is who has access and who is then pushed out. And this, of course, does not only boil down to infrastructure. Infrastructure is important. However, it's also where these tools are coming from and who provides them. There's a growing Chinese market on bicycles. But what also I've witnessed when doing research, my own research on cycling, is that when the policies become difficult for people to access bicycles, then you have another mode of mobility that begins to emerge. In Nairobi, for example, there was an active policy to encourage the import of motorcycles. And in 2012, the president removed the taxes on motorcycles, on vehicles under 250 carrying capacity. And that led to an influx of motorcycles, which begs the question, if the same policies are implemented for bicycles, would there be then maybe an import of e-bicycles, for example? And that is something that is still in question in many African cities. And I think that's what makes that's what keeps cycling in as a poor mode of mobility, because the people who cycle have only cycled with regular bicycles, the grandma bicycles as they are called. And the people then who take part in the critical mass are people who have more chic bikes and have the capacity to import the bicycles. So it's still a question, it's a question of representation, but also a question of policy and support, government support.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because one of the things that two researchers have documented is that the influx of very cheap bicycles from Japan and China that were actually not high quality as they had been before meant that bicycles break down all the time, particularly because they're used in the African context for transporting goods and people, bicycle taxis and basically being little trucks, if you will. And so what you see is an enormous, a thriving culture of repair and maintenance and ingenuity. It is true that, let's say, high-end bicycles are not accessible at all, but the other bicycles also means that people who rely on it have to invent new ways to make that possible. So that is actually quite a very nice insight from the research that we have done. And I also, what I've learned, for example, in Mozambique, Maputo, on the one hand, the image of cycling as for the poor, for rural folks, and then you have a middle class that Dorcas is talking about in Nairobi, that is being supported by critical mass and all kinds of other organizations. Both have international NGOs behind it, but they cater to very different cycling cultures. So you have in one city two completely different cycling cultures. Same in Johannesburg. Johannesburg and Cape Town are examples where you have a middle class, leisure cycling culture, some utility cycling, but also neighborhood-based in the townships where organizations are trying to connect employment, accessibility, and mobility justice as one. And that's a really a wonderful development to see. But my point is that these images of what cycling means can exist at the same time in the same place. That's astounding. And so the question for me is it possible for middle class people to make connections with that other culture, to be supportive of each other? Because in that coalition, I think that would be really powerful.
Yes, and I think that's true of all social movements, is that building solidarity across classes and culture and different groups and different causes is the key to building and maintaining change. Absolutely. I wanted to shout out Supriya Dada at Critical Mass in Nairobi, because she was a guest on the show and spoke about some of these things about the perception of cycling in a city like Nairobi that has this emerging cycling culture, and all of the work it takes to change that culture. And she addressed some of the things, Dorcas, that you have mentioned. I want to talk a little bit about those social movements. We have Critical Mass here in the States. I think about the Fietsersbond in the Netherlands and other advocacy organizations across Europe. Let's talk about the importance of these advocacy organizations. Not every city has a big one. Did you find any cycling cities that somehow emerged and became cycling cities without this, or is it really one of the pieces you must have?
To be honest, that part turned out to be more difficult to document. It's not just like Stop the Kindermoord or the Fietserbond, what we're so familiar with in the European context, which is very much a 1970s phenomenon. I think that the social movement in the African context is somewhat different. And we have to be honest that social movement also means that the people who advocated cars, right, that really is very important in these these contexts. So there is a social movement, but it's maybe not the social movement that we want, that was sort of going against what was a movement, but unorganized movement of cyclists. Critical mass, Nairobi being an example, Cairo being an example, Maputo being an example, Johannesburg, Cape Town. These are all cities that are part of a transnational movement of a critical mass, and they are very, very important. There is another kind of social movement that we got sort of a little inkling, is that in some of these cities there were bicycle factories. So in Kano, Nigeria, and in Chipata, Zambia, there was local support for the bicycle industry. And that actually translated in policy that was at least not adverse to cycling and somewhat supportive. So it's not your classic social movement, but it is about how policy is supported by the right stakeholders, and that we have seen in this research that that's important.
In some African cities as well, the representation comes from external actors. So, for instance, there's a lot of support from, say, a technical cooperation. So you would have an organization like JICA, for example, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, who comes to support the development of infrastructure. And then with that development, part of the plan requires building walking and cycling infrastructure. And that's where most of the support has come from. The United Nations Environment Programme or the International Transport and Development Policy, they've also been activists in advancing walking and cycling in African cities. But this is coming from people who have who directly talk to governments or have direct access with governments and policymakers, and less so from the people themselves who should then be advocating for this. It's a different case in Nairobi, but in other cities you can see that the people who are pushing for this infrastructure are external parties that are working directly with governments.
And of course, then you have to have a friendly government, which is one of the factors that you cite in the cycling studies research. How do you get that? That, I think, is the biggest question we all tend to ask, because you can have the social movements, you can have the bike shops and the bike factories located in your city or in your country. But if you have elected officials who are actively hostile to these policies, you're not going to get very far. And we've joked in the past about, you almost need like a benevolent dictator in some countries and some cities in order to push these things through. So, Dorcas, you're talking about outside, NGOs coming in and working with government, but the government has to be receptive to that. What do you do if you're faced with a government that is at best indifferent and at worst hostile to these policies?
I think it's important to say that the model of the social movement is very much based on the European idea that when cars became overwhelming and took over cities, that's the moment, the historical moment that people said, hey, wait a minute, we don't want that, because they remembered what a city was like without cars. In a lot of the global south and in African cities, there are a couple of cities like Kano or for example, Erbil in Iraq or Tehran in Iran, where governments are totally overwhelmed by cars. And these, by the way, are also oil-dependent cities, right? So the irony is that in those cities, you have governments that are actually desperate and think maybe bicycles are a solution. Now, that's a little bit, to say that's a little bit problematic, that's a euphemism. But it is interesting to see that in the cities that are totally overwhelmed by cars, that you see a movement towards bicycles. But in many of these African cities, cars are the absolute minority, and that is sort of the image that we have to get out of our head, is that people walk, still majority in Africa, and people do transit. So, as I said, motorcycles or bicycle taxis. And so I think that is, if there's work to do, it is to reframe our mind and to say it's not just about cars. In some cities, it is totally about cars, but in others, it is about imagining a future that is based on shared mobility and not just on individual mobility like cars. And a lot of the arguments for building roads is based, of course, that motorization is an economic engine. Well, what they usually do, and Dorcas has worked on this, there are all these data sets where conveniently cars and trucks are put into one category, and then they say, look, we need all this infrastructure because it's overwhelming. Yeah, well, if you have 4% private cars and you have 80% trucks, and you then push private automobility, that's really wrong. So I think there's a lot of the data that are presented as facts about the inevitability of cars is really something where we have to start. And Dorcas, you have worked on this, so you have some great insights on this, I think.
Yeah, I just to maybe point out to what you said about support from policymakers. That is, I have witnessed that to be a key factor in advancing walking and cycling in cities. And this is based on a very special moment that happened in Nairobi between 2020 and 2022. We had a change in governance. We had an ad hoc body that came to fill in the space of the then resigned governor. And what they did, they decided to actively prioritize walking and cycling. And so the question that many people ask themselves, so what has been the case in the previous governments, that there was no support for walking and cycling? They were able to construct more than 10 kilometers of walking and cycling infrastructure throughout the city center and in the outskirts, a bit in the outskirts of the city center. But it was this policy support, political support, that showed, there was evidence that it's able to actualize this and to support walking and cycling, even when other parts of the industry are not there. In the industry, I mean like bicycle manufacturing and so forth. But it was possible to see that all you need is a champion in the government who says, I'm going to take this on and I'm going to push this forward. And I think that is what we lack mainly in I would say in many African cities. I'm also witnessing this in a project that I'm involved in Namibia, where the the ministries are still stuck on advancing highways as connecting people, and they fail to see that the large percentage of people in the city are actually pedestrians, and they tend to have the short end of the stick, yet they make up. I mean, it's really what the future of cycling cities is: walking cities that are hidden in plain sight. They're there, you see them, but they're also invisible at the same time.
Well, I think that hits at the biggest problem is that cars dominate the conversation, Ruth, like you were talking about, and Dorcas, like you just mentioned, because they are so visually present. And that cyclist who is carrying a load on her bicycle, weaving through traffic, is largely invisible. The person walking across that dangerous street that's jammed with traffic is also invisible.
But you're saying cars are visually, so present. But what we discovered is also that cars are constructed to be visually present in the data sets that we have. So, we are studying and deconstructing all these data sets, and it is, if you take out pedestrians, you always have, you focus on motorization, and then you show a couple of cars that are more than the previous year. You say, oh, it's an increase of 300%. Yeah, that's very convenient if you don't count the majority of people. And that happens over and over and over and over again. And I've become really convinced that I'll remain a cyclist forever. But I think pedestrianism is really the next frontier. If we take that seriously, if we count them in a modal split, then the conversation becomes totally different. Dorcas, help us remind what the modal split in Nairobi is if you bring in the pedestrians.
Yeah, in Nairobi it's currently 47% people who walk against 13% who have a car or actively drive a car.
13, huh?
13, 1-3.
And that is really, and Dorcas and I have had this conversation on and on, even in our own writing, we keep on prioritizing cars. We say, cars went up, cars went down, but when you study the figures and bring in pedestrians, the conversation is really different. The framing is different. So, and again, Doug, I don't want to sort of single out you as an American, but if you look at the globally at this modal split, and you look at the cities that have no walking, right? You end up in the US and you end up in Australia and New Zealand, but the rest of the world, people actually walk. And of course, in the US, you have fantastic walking cities like New York.
I've heard of it. Yes, yes.
Yeah, New York is a pretty good walking city. And that, again, I think that really changes the conversation if we take that seriously.
Well, look, even here, New York City is a walking city. It's a transit city, very much so, but it is a pedestrian city. And pedestrians are still left out of the conversation. We had a huge fight about congestion pricing, and so many of the arguments against it, or even for it, came down to drivers versus transit users versus cyclists. And there was there was a minority of us who were saying, hey, wait a minute. Most people experience Manhattan in particular on foot. Even if they do take transit, they emerge from a subway station and then they walk to their destination. Or let's not forget all the people who live in Manhattan and go about their daily lives on foot, never once getting in a car, maybe for months or years at a time. And pedestrians, even here, are left out of the conversation. And if you were to look at that mode split here and fold in pedestrians, they would be the overwhelming majority in so many ways.
But Doug, here's the question for you.
Yes.
You said, if you were to look at pedestrian, does that mean that you actually don't have the figures? That these, because you're describing kind of a fight and a conversation where it's about motorization or wheels. I think that, right, isn't that the problem, that you don't even, in policy making, just as starting points, always have to refer to modal split that involves pedestrians. I think from now on, that needs to happen everywhere.
I think that is a fantastic point, because I literally was just having this conversation at a community meeting last night where I said the number one piece of information that the Department of Transportation should include in every presentation they do about changing a street, whether it's a single parking space or an entire corridor, is to just put up at the top, here is the percentage of people in the neighborhood who live car-free. And so we do have that information, and that is the frustrating thing. But there's a cars first mentality, even among people who never drive and whose job it is to advance. I'm guilty of this at times too, whose job it is to advance pedestrianism and cycling. And I think this is a thing that is holding us back from becoming a cycling and walking city, even in a place where cyclists and pedestrians dominate.
Yeah, and so words like non-motorized is highly problematic because you still are in the frame of cars. And even if you say people who don't have cars, what do you call these people?
Just people, yes.
I mean, we need new words for that, because otherwise we all are always on the defense.
Well, it's funny because we had Marco Tabrummelstad on, and he talked about, I love the story that he tells about walking around his neighborhood and counting the number of homes that have helicopter landing pads. And of course, the answer is there are zero. And yet we don't say that the neighborhood is a helicopter-free zone because that would be absurd. And yet we talk about, low traffic neighborhoods or kid-friendly streets, which then implies that all the other streets are high traffic and unfriendly to children. So yes, I think a complete reframing of our language. I think that's the social movement piece of it as well that has to come in, not directly through radical style demonstrations, but just poking at language at every turn.
Yeah, so our book that's coming out in November, we're very proud to at least, it's in part it's storytelling about all these different cities, and it's also a kind of a visual fest with all these images of cycling in all these different contexts. But it's also retrieving the data that's buried deep in archives and are hard to read and are done hard to read for a purpose. We have seen reams of data in the 70s that were designed to make pedestrians and cyclists invisible. And, what we're doing is we are making an intervention here to start at least a conversation. A, we're there. B, we need more recovery. And then C, we need to rethink how we talk about this.
So in your research, were there cities that surprised you? Were there cities that jumped out as not your typical cycling city, but were showing incredible promise on their way to becoming a great one?
Well, I would say of the 17 African cities that our researchers have looked at, I see at least two types emerging. One are the ones that Dorcas is talking about. Lots of capital cities that were small, then exploded. They had a vibrant cycling culture, then lost it. Then the others are the small towns, usually overlooked by policy, or usually overlooked by any kind of facilities, and they have become cycling cities by default. And I am thinking of Gulu in northern Ghana, Uganda, then Chipata in Zambia, and Tamale in Ghana. Those are three cities that are cycling cities today, and their size does matter, and it also matters that there is no public transit. And in Chipata is a case where who would have known that they actually supported cycling policy in the 1980s with bicycle lanes. And we also have the wonderful example of a couple of countries, particularly in the post-independence, where a couple of socialist leaders were supporting cycling as a national policy. And here we're thinking of Tanzania with Nyerere, we're thinking about Nasser in Egypt, and also in Zambia and in Cameroon. There were moments where they actively supported the cycling industry, the bicycle industry, and also its policy. So that's really a new insight from the African continent.
So I want to bring it back to one of those marquee cities that we do talk about a lot, and that's Amsterdam, because there are a lot of examples and lessons that we can learn from that place. Ruth, I read an interview with you where you said that Amsterdam became the world bicycle capital almost by chance, and that its status as this cycling city arose by coincidence. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's indeed the chapter that we wrote 10 years ago for the European Cycling Cities book. It was basically to say Amsterdam was not just a cycling city and people were just sitting and didn't have to do anything, that Dutch people are born with DNA. No. There was a hard fight, and it's still going on for about 50 years, inch by inch, to make Amsterdam the cycling capital of the world. It is really a social movement that's really very important. But I must admit that since I wrote that 10 years ago, I also have had a new insight based on new research that the early designers, urban designers in the 1920s actually developed, maybe by accident, because that was not how they started. They were thinking about how should Amsterdam grow. And they looked at Los Angeles and said, no, we don't want that. London, no. So they wanted not to have a sprawl. And so they thought about and they did research and said, the city should never go beyond the bicycle trip from 25 minutes. So they actually thought about this in the 1930s. And the plan was not only a blueprint, but it actually was how Amsterdam was then developed. So here again, it's a kind of a surprising story about Amsterdam, that for a variety of reasons, there were people who thought about this, and there was also political will to do it. And then you had the cycling culture and a countercultural movement in the 70s that fought really hard and continues to do so to today. And so that's why we have a cycling city. And when I was young, I remember the city as being very bicycle unfriendly. You were choking because of the fumes. It was not pleasant at all. And so the lesson for everybody in the world is, yeah, you can become a Dutch cycling city. It's just a lot of work and a lot of thought goes into it. But it's not that your cause is lost. It's just a recognition that political fights are hard. And that we're in it together. That's, I think, the lesson from Amsterdam.
And Dorcas, we talk a lot about Americans making these pilgrimages to Amsterdam or Copenhagen, Berlin or Paris. If I were to ask you to recommend an African city that you think is doing everything right, that has these 5 factors in place, where should I go?
Yeah, that's a hard question. But before I answer your question, I want to just jump back on what Ruth was saying about Amsterdam, that it was done inch by inch. And when we talk about cycling cities, it's almost this vision that it should be a complete cycling city, as if like a jigsaw puzzle that comes to fit exactly on the city, that we have these complete streets that are cyclable, and then people can automatically from one day to the next be able to cycle around the city. But I think it boils down to looking at it as fragments or segments, if you like, that you add onto it bit by bit. And I think this is the approach that African cities should take. That's why I'm impressed with what the NMS in Nairobi did. That they just did a segment, and in hopes that in the future comes another government that says, hey, let's continue this segment that was started. And in a couple of years, you have a complete cycling city. So it's about taking step by step and fighting inch by inch. It's not a war that you start and then hope that you're going to win, but it's something that goes on for multiple years. But if we're talking about an ideal city, I don't think there is. You can talk about any ideal.
Well, maybe not ideal in the sense of like they've just got it all figured out, but a place where you feel like these things, like that jigsaw puzzle or like the segmented progress, where things are coming together and you can picture 10, 15, 20 years down the road, things being vastly improved. A place to visit to say, okay, we are a work in progress and here's what we're doing right.
Yeah, I would say maybe in this case, Addis is one city to look to, because Addis actively developed its walking and cycling infrastructure, and that has caused a change in how the city looks like, the modes of mobility that people use. But it's also a city that has actively invested in public transport, so that they have light rail that enable people to travel throughout the city. And I think, and in terms of walking as well, I would say the figures in Addis are almost as high as the figures in Nairobi. Nairobi has, of course, very high figures, but you have also a lot of people who walk in Addis. But what you can see is this shift in the political scene that recognizes that there is a certain group of people that has been ignored for a very long time, and that there needs to be a paradigm shift in the way people move around in the city and the way the government supports its own people to reach, to move around in the city. So I would say Addis is one of the cities to look to. But also, what's interesting is also Rwanda and Kigali. Kigali is also a model that has, that you can say has tried as much as possible to cater to the mobility needs of the people and how they move around in Kigali. There's a lot of motorcycle use in the city, and the government has actively supported the use of motorcycles in the city in terms of safety, in terms of accessibility, but also when you look at the walking and cycling infrastructure in the city of Kigali, it's a space that invites you to walk and cycle. Unlike other cities, unfortunately in Nairobi, it's a space that repels you to walk and cycle because just the infrastructure is not provided and the government does not look at the masses that move around. So those are maybe the two examples that I could take from East Africa and from the places I've been to. Perhaps there are other cities that are developing in a similar manner, but not one that I can point out based on my own research and experience.
All right, well, we'll have to get the War on Cars to some of those cities one of these days. So this is a podcast based in the United States. We have a big North American audience. The Cycling Cities project looked at just one North American city, I believe. Is that correct, Ruth?
Yeah, we have one American researcher working with us from Minneapolis. We are open for business for any other city in the United States. I'm actually, this whole project, you won't believe it, even though I'm Dutch, but I'm actually an Americanist by training. And it started because I wanted to understand what's the difference between the Netherlands and the United States. So I would absolutely love to, welcome more American cities.
So what's going right in Minneapolis? We were just there, my co-host Sarah and I, for a live show in April, and I happen to think it has perhaps the best cycling infrastructure of any North American city, aside from, say, Montreal. Not that there aren't good examples elsewhere, but in terms of a network and the off-street trails and the new on-street infrastructure that they're building, it's quite good. They have some really good political leaders who are leading the fight at the local and state level to get more infrastructure, to get more dollars for walking and cycling. They have some light rail. Minneapolis is coming together in lots of ways, and you can imagine it in 10 or 15 years or less, really, being sort of an ideal cycling city. So what are those factors beyond what I've described?
Well, to be honest, it is the researcher Peter Bird who selected that city. And I knew it already from historical research that it had been at the forefront of cycling advocacy in the 1910s. So it has a long history of cycling advocacy, but I think also it was a walking city. What does that mean? The industry where workers lived and where they worked were pretty close. And so it retained some of the compactness that maybe other cities did not in the US, and also retained public transit. So there were mobility alternatives. And then what Peter Bird also discovered is that African Americans kept on cycling in the 50s and in the 60s and the 70s. And then when the global counterculture movement in the 70s came around, it was building on that as well. So it has been able to retain its connections to the past, which was very rich in terms of cycling culture. And then, but you cannot just have a history. You also need exactly the points that you're making. You also need policy. You need allocation of funds. You need all these things to come together. But Minneapolis, I agree with you, has a real great chance to be that city in the U.S. that people should come and visit. And but I also think Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, New Orleans, similarly, and in the Minneapolis case does show that the physical, the coldness does not preclude cycling. I mean, that's always the excuse that people give. Well, we don't cycle because, the climate. But we have examples around the world. Zomba, in the mountains where people cycle. Basel, where there are mountains. In Limburg, there are mountains. And whether it's hot or cold, people will cycle if the rest of the environment is friendly. And that has more to do with traffic and other things than the climate. So the factor climate actually, I want to say, never really is the real reason why people don't cycle. Rain is just that other classic, but it rains so much. Well, even in the Netherlands, the cycling union in the Netherlands has calculated how often does it rain in the Netherlands, which is known as a rainy country. Well, it's like 6% or something of the time. So it's perception mostly that governs that.
Well, I think that's a big part of your research, is challenging those perceptions and leading us towards a place where every city hopefully could become, if all of these factors come together, a cycling city.
There should also be the war on rigid engineering policies, because that is one of the main factors that is causing, that is hindering advancing walking and cycling, because a lot of engineering designs date back from colonial periods in many cities, and they're still used until today. And what that means is that they were designed to put the car at the forefront. And I think it's time we start pushing back against that, and cities develop their own engineering designs that advance the mode of mobility that is dominant, because the numbers have shown there is evidence that walking and in some cities also cycling are the preferred modes of mobility. So how do we begin now to push back from these rigid engineering designs and call for a new a revolution in how engineering is practiced in many African cities?
I think that's such a great point, because I think it really brings it back to those 5 factors of the Cycling Cities project. It doesn't have this rigid approach, that like this is what works in Copenhagen and this is what works in Amsterdam. So therefore, just pick it up, put it in a box and move it to New York and move it to Nairobi. It really is contextual. And these are big buckets that you're putting in. The urban form is going to be different everywhere. The political leadership is going to be different everywhere. The social movements, in an American context versus an African one versus a European one, are all going to be a little different, or sometimes a lot different. But yet the larger, like I said, the buckets, the umbrellas that we're putting these things under really do point the way towards making, hopefully, every city a cycling city. Ruth and Dorcas, I want to thank you both so much for joining The War on Cars. It was really lovely conversation. I learned a lot speaking to both of you.
Thank you so much. And great to that you put the light on the African cities book, because it's so important. We've learned so much, and we're very much looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you for inviting us.
That is it for this episode of The War on Cars. You can find out more information about the Cycling Cities project by visiting cyclingcities.info. The War on Cars is produced with the generous support of the Helen and William Mazer Foundation and by listeners like you. Go to patreon.com/thewaroncarspod and support our independent podcast by becoming a member. You will get exclusive bonus content, ad-free versions of regular episodes like this one, merch discounts, and more. We extend our thanks to our top Patreon supporters, Charlie G. of Human Powered Law in Portland, Oregon, Virginia Baker, and Mark Hedlund. And don't forget, our new book, Life After Cars, is now available for pre-order. To get your copy, ask for it at your local bookstore or go to lifeaftercars.com. You can also find out more about our growing North American tour and get tickets to events in some cities right now. Thanks also to Cleverhood. You can save 15% off the best rain gear for cycling and walking with code SUMMERRAIN now through the end of the summer. Visit cleverhood.com/waroncars for more information. And thanks to Extracycle. There has never been a better time to get an electric cargo bike, and the good people at XtraCycle are ready to help you out. You can take the ride guide and find the perfect XtraCycle model for you and your family. Head to extracycle.com/thewaroncars. That's xtracycle.com/thewaroncars. This episode was produced and edited by me. Our music is by Nathaniel Goodyear. And on behalf of my co-host, Sarah Goodyear, I'm Doug Gordon, and this is The War on Cars.